I was taught pretty early on by some fabulous mentors who just changed the trajectory of my life that a business can be a vehicle for anything you want it to be, right? So it could be a vehicle for profit, but they looked at their businesses as a vehicle for impact and a vehicle for creating freedom and flexibility within their family. And when I look at my business, I see that. And I love the idea of adding value. I love the idea of creating impact. It's so cool to me to think about creating value in terms of creating a career path for other people and trajectory for them that wouldn't have existed had you not created this company. Like just using your business as a vehicle for positive change and impact, both on the micro level within your team, but also on the macro level within an industry. How else can you do that? In what other field can you make that happen? I just think that entrepreneurship and being able to carve your own path in that way is so unique.
What was it like transitioning from being an advisor to having your own business? There must have been a lot going on there for you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lee. It was definitely an intentional shift, both because I was getting to the point with my book of business as an advisor where I'm a creator. I'm a creative entrepreneur. I'm always kind of like, what's next, looking around the corner. And so I often know it's time to evolve when I start feeling that tension of, I enjoy what I'm doing, but I'm kind of antsy for what's next. And so deciding to build my own company, eventually move into the CEO role, eventually move out of travel advising entirely. And those were all different milestones, right? Each of those times, it felt like it was both the necessary step because it was what my company needed, but it was also a salvation type step for myself, right? To keep me sane. I knew it was what I needed. So it's kind of an external and an internal response for me.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's great. And were you glad you did it immediately, or was there a period of time? Like, for example, when I started my first business, it was a crumbling situation. I was told, sell it or close it. You got 30 days. Went from 25 employees down to 3. Couldn't find anybody to buy it. So I said, let me assume $600K in debt. You walk away from it, and I want to go this way that you don't believe in. The second after I did it, I was thinking, why didn't I do this 10 years ago? What was that like for you? Happy? Questioning?
Yeah. I would say, of course, in retrospect, yes, I was celebrating the immediate next day. I think that there were learning curves with each of those transitions. And so, for example, a big one was going from being a salesperson, right? Being the wearing all the hats and being the face of the company and closing all the sales, planning all the trips. That had an immediate bottom line impact that I could evaluate it every single day. And I tied a lot of my self-worth to my production, and I could quantify that. And then when you move into a CEO role, that all goes away, right? Like you don't have I made a sale today, thus my job is done. It became much more, as it should be, big picture, vision casting, kind of less tangible to be able to measure it. And that actually took me a little while to get used to. I knew it was the right decision because it was the right decision for the company, but I almost had to, learn myself what it meant to be a effective, good CEO.
Yeah, it all has to work, and the buck kind of stops with us. It's not one or two things, and I'm done. I love the way you said that. It's holistic, and we're never done with that.
Yeah.
And so how do we, of course, I mean, just a little bit on my background. I started 8 companies from scratch. Biggest one had over 500 employees. We were doing business in 60 countries.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, this is where we're going. It's about increasing the value of the business, creating value in 3 different areas, and stopping to celebrate with the team. I had to force myself to do that. I'm excited about where we're going, but what do you do to celebrate with a team? Because you're up to 80 employees now. Is that about right?
Yeah, we have a team of 90 between in-house employees. We've got independent contractors. We've got a beautiful, beautiful team at Jetset, and I'm so proud of them. Actually, stopping to celebrate is one of our 3 core values, because there was a point when I first became a travel advisor where everything felt so life or death. And it's so funny. You're planning vacations. You're not doing, actual brain surgery over here. And yet it was always on fire. It's a very fast paced industry. And someone is stuck on the island of Capri and you have to get them off. And then another client's ready to book for the summer of 2025 to South Africa. And then someone else says, I need a dinner reservation. Like, you've just got so many balls in the air that I one of our core values is we create fun and we celebrate constantly, because I agree with you. I think it's so easy to get caught up either in the day-to-day minutia, or if you're a big picture thinker and you're a vision caster, you're always thinking what's next, and you don't remind yourself to slow down, stop, and actually celebrate. So that's part of our company culture.
Yeah, I love that. I do a lot of work around this holistic value creation model with for-profit companies from startup to closing on 100 billion market cap, lots of nonprofits, as well as families, creating a holistic value creation culture within families. So there's material, and that's what most people think about. But what it feels like to be in the family, the emotional energy, super important. The spiritual side, the connectedness piece, kids with themselves, family with each other, all the way to a higher power, whatever is important to each family. And I think about the travel side of it, the emotional energy and the spiritual or connectedness value that could be created is over the top. How do you talk about the value you're creating for these families when they travel with your team?
Mm. It's such a good question, because one of the most frequent questions we get asked as travel advisors is, wait, I thought that industry died with the internet. Like most people don't even know travel advisors exist. And granted, the pandemic actually helped us tremendously after it nearly leveled us, and that more people are looking for advisors to help. But I give you that background to say that the reason travel advisors succeed nowadays is because they're no longer transactional, right? The internet can very easily process a transaction, but now we are so relationship driven that getting to know our clients and getting invested into their why, and why are you planning this trip, and what does each individual want to achieve out of it? I joke and I say it's like 90% therapy and 10% travel planning, because you're so ingrained with this family. And I love that you bring that up in terms of like bringing value to a family and the actual emotional impact that travel has on us. Because if we miss that piece, then we're absolutely not stewarding what these clients are bringing to us. And what they're bringing to us is not just their time and their money, their resources. They're usually bringing this little fragile gift that is their dream, right? Like, what have I been dreaming of? I've got this idea in the back of my head. I want to turn it into a reality. I want this. My partner wants this. My children want this. How do we bring that into a real thriving situation that they get to look forward to, and then they get to live out? So there is so much emotion that goes into the planning and the execution of travel. And I think that's one of the big things that sets Jetset apart, is we talk about that so frequently on our team internally. It's part of our culture. It's believing in the value we add with everyone that we're serving. That emotional piece is absolutely critical to travel planning.
Yeah, I think of it as you're selling an experience. And I think of trips where I've had lots of people going along, extended family, friends, colleagues, whatever. It could be as simple as Telluride, and I've got a house and we have 30 people staying there, and we have ski lessons set up for everybody, and dinner reservations and somebody coming in. I remember one year I took care of all of it, and it was work. And so you would handle all of those. I never did it again.
Yep. Yep.
But you handle all of that. I mean, whatever needs handling, you can do that. Yes.
Yeah. We call it doorstep to doorstep service. So as soon as you leave, as soon as you return, we want to cover everything that you are having to encounter. And you know this too, Lee, of travel, it's almost never going to go according to plan. And so even though we might spend dozens of hours planning this trip on the front end, one strike or one hurricane or one whatever misconnection, anything can make this new game that we're playing as you're living it out. And so having someone on your side for those moments where you're not having to plan, you're not spending hundreds of hours planning and then replanning as you go along should something go wrong, is, I mean, that alone, I'm grateful for my team, because I rely on them now that I travel, and I'm like, how are you supposed to do this for yourself? It's so much, especially if you are a professional, you've got a full-time job, you're an executive of some sort, like you don't have time for that.
Yeah. I remember going to Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji for 6 weeks total back in the mid 80s with two of my friends. And this is how I travel. If it's just me and I'm not worried about a big group, is we book the first night at each location and everything else is whatever we wanted to do.
Yeah.
But with groups, it's a lot more complicated than that going through. When you think about, because stuff goes wrong, you say hurricane, it could be anything really. I remember landing in Fiji, and we're getting ready to leave, and they said, "Oh, your plane left yesterday." I'm like, "What? Like, how do we?"
Yeah.
You should have called a minute earlier. But
That sounds like Fiji. That probably wasn't you guys looking at your itinerary wrong. That's just some destinations are going to operate on their own time.
oh yeah, yeah. Oh well, we have to jump back in the
Well,
ocean for another
yeah.
day or two. That's it's totally fine. But when you think about what's an example of something that went really wrong, and how you made it right for a family traveling, as an example.
Oh my gosh. I could come up with dozens of examples. And I know my team has even more recent examples because I haven't actually sat as a frontline travel advisor in about 5, 6 years since I transitioned to CEO, since we really started working to scale Jetset. And, but I can think of when I was really early on, my very first one, like, right? You never forget that first time that you're just jolted out of bed at 3 a.m. because the client is calling on repeat and you have to figure out, oh, that hurricane that was brewing is actually actively affecting their destination wedding. And so mine was a group at that time too, where you've got individuals here to celebrate this beautiful, momentous occasion. Thank God they were able to have the wedding, but oh my goodness, now the airport is closed and no one can get out, right? And so that was a situation where they were on an island with 2 airports, one closed due to flooding, one was still open, but it was the island where you had to take puddle jumpers. And I had to just logistically figure out, how do I get them from St. Lucia to St. Martin, back to the States, back to their home in the state? I mean, it was so much of it is logistics and being able to think outside the box. And, if you just think, well, the airport's closed, I can't do anything about it, then you didn't realize there's a second airport. You've got to always be on your feet, researching the destinations, learning about it, having partners on the ground who can assist you. And so the logistical part of this, of being able to think through, what do I do in this very specific situation where this one way out is no longer a way out? That is one of many examples. I mean, we have so many from the pandemic, of course, too, as borders were closing and my team was literally rescuing individuals as Egypt was closing its borders. Argentina was closing its borders, getting them out on the last plane. We've got your seat booked. Get to the airport right now. I mean, it really does become pretty critical at times.
Yeah, no question. I see the value in what you're talking about. Have you had any difficulty communicating the value of your services? Because I'm really, really interested in, one of my businesses is professional services as well, and we do a lot of different things. Communicating the value of it, and then how do you charge for it? So, what have been your challenges there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think what you and I have just talked about for the past 5 minutes are easy to talk about the value of what happens when it goes wrong. And I don't like to sell based off of that, right? Like, I don't like to give a scare tactic or make them feel like it's insurance or something like that and sell based off of, well, have you thought about this? So I like to communicate the value from the place of the actual value we are bringing, whether things go right or wrong. And that's the service level. And we did something a few years ago. The industry's always been very divided on, do we charge for our service? Is it a complimentary service? We're getting paid by the hotels for the most part. So what does that look like? And when I had reached a critical point in my business where it was so overwhelming and I had so many clients because I loved what I did, I was so passionate about it, but I was beginning to burn out. And I started realizing the opportunity of, well, I am bringing a really unique skill set, amazing expertise, amazing connections to the table. There is value in this and I need to be charging for this. So I started charging for my service. I've been doing this 15 years, so it's probably about 10 years ago. And I moved from the model of a sales-based company to a service-based company. And that then became the model that what is now known as Jetset follows today, where we very much stand in honor of what we are doing. And what we are doing is we are stewarding a client's most precious assets, and that is their free leisure time. They cannot get that time back. Those are the memories they're going to go on to create with their children, with their partners. These are incredible trips. And so if it's a situation where someone's going, this trip's not really meaningful to me and I've got time to plan it and whatever, or maybe they're going more spontaneously, I'm just going to book a flight and get there. No, that's not our ideal client. We're not trying to articulate our values to them. But if it is someone who's saying, wow, this is a very meaningful trip to me. I don't get to travel with my family more than one time a year. I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to rely on someone else's TripAdvisor review because they've never been out of their hometown and they don't have all the same background that I do. Like, why would we do that? Why would we take that risk? So I'm super passionate about it because I do think at this point, it doesn't take a lot of articulation of why. You're either the type of person who calls a professional for the needs that you don't know how to fix yourself, or you're the type that tries to do it yourself. And travel for a lot of people, especially in this current generation, is just one of those things that they say, we need an expert for that. And I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah. You mentioned burnout in there. So I always have to remember, and I work with a lot of different companies, a lot of leaders. It's been hundreds of companies, thousands of leaders over the years. I've gone through a bunch of stuff and I have to remember, hey, they're going through it now too. And it feels super intense. Like I've learned to leverage burnout in terms of what it's telling me and how I can use it to create more value going forward. How did you get through that? How do you think about burnout and what is it telling you and what do you do with it?
Gosh, I really like the way you think and the way you phrase that and leveraging it, because I'm a big fan of doing that with the nasty emotions that we face, right? Whether it's burnout, whether it is imposter syndrome, whether it's the inner critic that's in our head. I think that those are all opportunities instead of obstacles. And this is a large part of my story and how we came to grow Jetset over these past few years, right? Is it's looking at the negative and how can we actually use it to our advantage. So burnout has been one of those very specific things for me. And now granted, there are times when you are so deeply ingrained in burnout that there needs to be medical professionals assisting you getting through it, right? Like this is to your core something physical, a manifestation that is happening. And the lack of resiliency shows you that you need more partners and team members on your side to help you get through it. But then there are the times where I've had burnout where it's simply like, I just cannot stand another day in this position because I can see so clearly what I could be doing instead. Like those are the times where I think burnout is my body's way of saying it is time to evolve, both for yourself and for the better good of this company. You've got to move up and into a different position. And so when I think back to every milestone, whether it was transitioning from, travel advisor to creating my own company, whether it was creating the company, then transitioning to CEO, each of those followed a season of burnout.
Yeah, I've actually learned, this is how I think about it. I've learned to trust the struggle. So even when it's really hard, I just know inside, as long as I stick with it, I'm going to come out the other side more capable and able to create even more value. And so I think these are just healthy struggles that CEOs need to go through and figure it out. And whenever I hear individuals say, well, I could be doing this or doing that, the grass really isn't that greener anywhere else. Why don't you do the work here where you're at going forward? And uh, burnout to me is doing the same thing and staying stuck. That is like, this isn't working at all. It means that there's a better way. I need to discover it. I can't see it, but it's my job to find it. But there's a lot in there about trusting the struggle and come out the
Yeah.
other side. Why do we make it bad? Why, I think we're taking struggle away from kids and they're not ready for adulthood.
Mhm.
And now adults, we're talking culturally, at least in the United States, that struggle is bad. My gosh, it's not. It's how we grow physically, emotionally, mentally. Talk a little bit about that because you've definitely gone through a lot of this.
Yeah, I have. And I had this phrased really well. I was just thinking of this as you were explaining that. It reminded me of a conversation I had the other day, an interview that I was doing on Who Made You the Boss with one of my dearest friends and mentors. Her name is Shannon Miles. And she brought up, I said, how did you take the risk to start your company? They did it during a time where their kids were so young and it was the Great Recession and they both quit their jobs on the same day, she and her husband. And she said, people forget that it's also a risk to stay where you are. And that resonated, right? Like it is, you've got to weigh the risk that you're taking. You've got to think about the fact that like, if you're struggling here, the fear might be that you're going to struggle over there too. If you think you're okay here, the fear is that you're taking a risk by leaving, but you're actually taking a risk by staying rooted in that wrong position. And I think about that now. Gosh, I thought that made such a big impact because yes, there have been those times that we've struggled. My husband is my business partner. We were 5 months pregnant when the pandemic hit. All eggs in one basket, meaning that we were, in this travel agency together, which is not the best business to have in a pandemic. And we had to walk away from our home to keep our business alive. Like we had to make some very painful choices because we could see the future. And to your point, I think I had as hard as that time was, and man, it was really hard. It was 18 months of in the red and every day opening our spreadsheet and going, how much longer can we last? Oh, there's more government assistance. Okay, cool. That bought us another 3 months, like really having to make those constant daily decisions that can really start eroding your patience and your resilience over time. But having the big picture understanding that this is not happening to us, but this is happening for us. And that was, I would say, and I come from a faith background, I'm a Christian, and I was able to really apply a faith lens on that and say, okay, I know as hard as this is, I know I'm going to be able to use it on the other side to help others, to grow ourselves, to grow the business. And now, of course, in retrospect, wow, that was what catapulted us completely. That got us the opportunity to acquire another company. We just landed number 255 on the Inc. 5000 list for fastest growing companies in the US. And that to me is so wild, would have never happened without that struggle.
Yeah, for sure. Also, what I'm hearing in there is if you're left standing when the dust settles after COVID, it's only up, and it's gonna go up fast in terms of a business. And uh, my biggest companies that I sold were in aerospace. I remember when 9/11 happened, and they were parking planes all over the world. People weren't flying. I was in the aviation aftermarket. We repaired and overhauled to safely reduce aircraft operating costs, different components and assemblies. Our competitors right and left were going out of business. Everybody's shutting down. And I thought, you know what? We're gonna work with everyone. The airline's going into bankruptcy. We're gonna come out the other side, and we're gonna be positioned so much better. Didn't have to lay anybody off. We grew incredibly fast. Our competitors hurt themselves by the way they reacted to what was going on. So
Yeah.
it feels like there's some of that with what you were doing. We're going to be here. We're going to spend time building the foundation so we can really grow and create even more value for our clients. Was that part of the thinking?
Yeah, it was. And I know everyone's favorite and least favorite word during that time was pivot, 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 pivot. How can we adapt? And I actually think for us, it was understanding, well, what is within our control? And to your point, when you were going through that, you were able to say, all right, well, we can actually go ahead and work on this. We don't have to stay standing still. Like, I think when that happens, a lot of times people in that fight or flight mode, they freeze, and that becomes their downfall on the other side when there is a recovery that's beginning. So for us, we started looking around and saying, well, we have very little in our control right now, but one of the things we can control is the way we show up in the world. And so we made it a short-term mission in our company to be a beacon. And we set that mission to every single team member that was with us at the time. We had a team of 10. And we were able to say, all right, let's go into our industry and be a light during our darkest hour. What does that look like? How do we open our doors? How do we bring others in? How do we help others during this time? And just like, this is within our control, right? Our attitudes and our ability to serve others. And it was that project that we did together that led to the acquisition opportunity, that led to tremendous growth on the other side. So you just never know, Lee, when you're in that position, it's so easy and tempting to just put your head in the sand and hope for it all to be over. And granted, sometimes that just happens, right? Sometimes like mental health is extremely important to me. And there are just times where, wow, if the world is that bleak and I can't get out of bed, like I can't be expected to show up as a leader, right? But then there are the times where you can look around and say, okay, but I'm in a decent place and I can actually help others during this time by showing up in this way that I know will help them. And so it's just deciding what's in our control.
Yeah, I always like to step back. It's one of my hacks and go, okay, well, if the entire industry got cut in half, just thinking about aerospace for some of my companies, okay, well, that still means there's almost $1 trillion of business going on out there.
Yeah.
I think we can find a niche, and because we're still a grain of sand. The biggest one was about 100 million in sales when I sold it in 2016,
Yeah.
and I saw a way to 500 million and then 1 billion. It's like, this would be so easy, to do that. So making our organizations recession proof,
Mm-hmm.
and then stepping back and saying, well, wait a minute, how big is this, and where could we fit in there?
Yeah.
That's how I looked at it. Does that make sense to you? Kind of thinking about being recession proof, and what is the plan to get there, essentially, if
Yeah.
something bad happens? Like, and I'm assuming through COVID that gave you the opportunity for the acquisition because they were struggling and trying to figure it out too.
Yeah.
I'm guessing. I don't know.
Yeah. That's very accurate. And understanding that this is an industry that will come back. People are going to travel again, right? It's the matter of when, due to circumstances. So knowing that when others were saying the sky is falling and it's never going to be the same, going, you're right, it's never going to be the same. It actually could be better, which is exactly what it was. So starting to give the benefit of the doubt on that. And, I work in a luxury services industry. So I also understand that recession proof looks a little bit different given that particular scenario. But what we have seen through most major recessions that I've been alive for, at least, people still travel. They just might travel a little bit differently. And typically the wealthier clients that are already planning these trips are less impacted. And so, as harsh of a reality as that is, knowing your market and knowing who's impacted during those times, has been helpful to be able to put pen to paper and say, okay, could we still survive if ... And to your point, we would do those exercises. And the question was, could we survive if we were 25% down, 30% down, 40% down? And then of course we got the exercise of COVID, which was, could you survive if you were 100+% down? And because we had thought about it beforehand, so that would be my advice for business owners listening. Like, it's not a fun exercise to do, but we are luckily in a group that assigned this as homework in another owners group. And so we had done that homework 6 months before. And so we'd already been thinking about, well, what if worst case scenario does happen? For us, election years tend to be a slower year. So let's make sure we put pen to paper on what it looks like if it's a slower year because of the election. Like that, just knowing the nature of your industry, to your point, and where you can fit into it, can just help you better prepare.
Yeah, and at the time of the hit, if something happens to the industry, dramatically affects your business, that's not the time to start having the conversation.
Right.
We need to have it before. What are the risks?
Yeah.
What would we do? How do we think about it? And again, I just love every year going, okay, how can we make ourselves even more recession proof, going through? Because there's a pretty big world out there, a lot of business.
Yeah. What does that look like for you? Do you set aside like a goal planning session, or how do you begin to ask yourself that question and then answer it?
Well, I've heard you talk about it on other podcasts around working on the business versus in the business. I mean, that's a general thing a lot of business folks say, but what does that really mean? And I think when companies drift, to me, it's because they just got in a group. They stopped thinking about responsibly increasing the value of their business. Because to me, strategy is nothing more than approaches to increasing the value of your business responsibly. Yeah. That's it. I think every CEO's job is to continually and responsibly increase the value of their business. So that's an evergreen process. And a lot of times just saying once a year, we're going to plan for this. Well, I think it's good to do deep dives on it. However, it's evergreen and you're adjusting as it makes sense to do it for each business, and every business is going to be different. So I'm not a huge fan of the big annual planning process. I'm a fan of evergreen strategy. So if we say, here are 3 things or 5 things that can significantly increase the value of the business, we believe, great. Now, every leader and their team, how can they support that given the, their position in the business, the function, et cetera? And then what I want to know is, hey, for this particular team, how are you designed to create value for the organization? Where are you at? Where are you going? At any point in time, are you on track or not? And then what's the best work that you're doing to increase that value? And then I think for you and I, we've got these different functions. Are they all in balance?
Yeah.
Or because one too high can take us out of the game to a degree, one too low can, too far either way could blow everything up. But that's the simple way that I think about it. So continuous improvement, I think, has to be part of the culture. Like we all do this. We can see the value everybody's creating, want to keep it in balance. But there will be strategic initiatives that can step change what we're trying to do in terms of value being created. How does that resonate with you?
I love the phrase continuous improvement, because I think about it exactly as you outlined in the actual execution of the business, right? But also in how I pour into myself as a CEO. And I am in full belief that the moment you stop growing, your company stops growing. And so there's also this kind of like tension you've got to walk of, what does it look like this year for me to grow as a leader? So I'm with you. I do probably take more of an annual approach when it comes to, just because my husband and I are business partners and we have this time set aside, right, to like cast the vision for the year. But we are constantly talking about it throughout the year and adjusting as we go, right? We have like meetings set aside every single week to work on the business and not in the business. And so it's carving out that intentional time and just making sure, this was such a good phrase that I heard one time. Bob Goff, who's an awesome influence in my life and fantastic, author, activist, everything. He made the point that on a compass, if it's pointing north, if it's off even just a little bit, if you're trying to get to north, you'll never get there, right? Like if you just have it a degree off, you're going to veer away from your North Star. And I always think about that it's great if you're going to set once a year a North Star, but if you're not constantly taking the temperature of that and making sure that your compass is correctly pointing north and not slightly askew, then you can very easily be brought off track from what you're planning.
Yeah. So you're basically doing what I do, what I advocate all companies do. I find that it is also easy for leaders to do things that aren't really creating a lot of value. They're going a different direction, but it feels good, sounds good to them.
Yeah.
And so I spent a lot of time educating every leader on what is our business model? How do we price? What are all the things that go into the expenses around it? What's the profit? And exciting, what's the potential for future profit? So
Yeah.
they need to understand that, understand how strategy applies. Usually there's only 3 or 4 things that a company does that creates more than 80% of the value. How well are we doing those things? And if it's not 8 or 9, we shouldn't be doing additional things until we do those better. And then intense focus on the value of our product or service and how they can impact it. And then culture, whatever that is. So I'm constantly nudging in those 4 areas with my businesses. And I'm on number 8 now that I've started, plus my clients when I work with them. I actually have 3 full CEO peer advisory groups that I run. It's called Execute Masterminds.
Mm-hmm.
And so 1 full day commitment for each. And so here's 24 CEOs. And that's all we're doing is what are the few things that create the most value? What are we doing to increase the value of the business walking through? So yeah, it should be continuous. It shouldn't be just set it and forget it. And I think
Yeah.
that's where companies
Yeah.
get in trouble.
Yeah, I agree. I love the idea of a peer advisory group. That has been instrumental for us as well. And just we were fortunate enough to get into one right before we launched on our own as an independent company, and to feel, you know, individuals who have been walking this walk for years and years and years ahead of you that can pour into you, but also just look around and say, oh, we have something to bring to the table as well. You know, like we have a new, fresh set of perspectives to also contribute. That peer advisory group has been huge for us over the years.
Yeah, where do you go for practical CEO wisdom? What
Yeah.
works, what doesn't work, and just keep building on that over time. So
Yeah.
I love that you're doing that. I've heard you talk about perfectionism. I want to talk about that as well as imposter syndrome. I remember going through everything has to be perfect before I do anything. And I just shifted to, wait a minute, we're going that way. Are we making progress? Yes or no? And then the next question is, are we making progress fast enough? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Um, and I live there and knowing that it's never going to be perfect. But how do you think about that? How did you say, hey, this is a challenge or a potential issue?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. That done is better than perfect. That is probably that, and the idea of control are probably my lifelong lessons to learn. So as much as I think that I have conquered them or moved forward, it's just an eternal battle of it showing up now as a mother or it's showing up as a wife. You know, like it shows up in so many different ways, all holistically in our lives. But perfectionism is definitely something I battled, as well as imposter syndrome, to the point where I created the podcast that I created, right? The idea of who made you the boss is because I ask myself that question when I look in the mirror on my worst days, right? Who did this? Like, I did it. Oh my God, I did it. Now I have to live up to it. But if people only knew how much I'm getting it wrong or how much I question it, you know, like it was just, I wanted to finally put out in the open and talk about the insecurities that I think are very common, especially in leadership. And the more you rise in leadership, the less likely you are to be able to talk about that openly. And I just think that can hurt our next generation of leaders, right? That if you start thinking, am I the only one who feels this way? Or I guess, you know, this is just my perfectionism and my problem. Like, not necessarily. Like we can all share in this burden together. So I 100% am a recovering perfectionist, and highly recommend, if you haven't read the Perfectionist Guide to Losing Control, that book is phenomenal. But just to start better understanding like where your perfectionism stems from, you know, and mine is like more of a messy, you would not look at my desk and think I'm a perfectionist, but you would see how I start projects and what that looks like and when I'm willing to put them into the world and see evidence of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting for me to watch because all the business leaders had one wonderful woman in one of my groups, just super hard on herself. And I can't believe this and I can't believe that. And as you're talking, I was thinking back to that conversation where because it's not as good as she knew at the time it could be, she's really hard on herself. And I said, well, let's just back up for a second. You've got like a $10 million business here making a couple $1 million a year. What percentage of the population can say they do
Yeah.
that? look at everything you learned from this thing that didn't work in the last month. It's like, I admire you for what you've been able
Mhm.
to accomplish, and so many others do too. So is that the essence of it? I'm not perfect, so therefore maybe I don't belong here. Others must be perfect, because I've never met the perfect CEO or leader anywhere.
Yeah, I think we get these ideas of what should appear and what we should be doing. And my therapist always says, like, you got to watch out for the shoulds, right? What a good CEO should do or what a good business owner should do. Like, those are usually evidence of misgivings that we've kind of believed all of our lives about that ideal that we have in our heads. I've come to, I think you're spot on in that you have to reframe it, right? The way that you did for your coaching client, and saying, like, have you actually considered that you are in the minority of humans, right? To have created this. So give yourself a break and actually celebrate for a second, going back to that celebration idea. But also I've come to, much like we've been talking about turning obstacles into opportunities, right? And looking at the burnout as an opportunity to leverage. I look at things like imposter syndrome and try to go against the common culture of, well, just silence that, or just get over it, or just move forward, or be really harsh about it. I look at that and think, oh, I think this is a really good sign that you are having that experience, right? This means if imposter syndrome is present, you are stepping out of your comfort zone. You're putting yourself in a new scenario. Bravo to you for putting yourself in that. And now the big thing is you just have to work through it, let it be present, acknowledge it, but don't let it stop you. And so not shaming yourself because you have it, because we all have it, but saying, I'm just not going to listen to that voice, but I'm really glad it's here because it means I'm doing something scary.
Yeah. And you're really right on the edge of where you need to develop next,
Yeah.
professionally or personally. And so that's a really good sign. Let's value that struggle.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever felt the imposter syndrome. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't have mentors early on, and I reinvented the wheel over and over and over again. I
Mm-hmm.
don't recommend that for anyone. It worked out, which is great. I was actually kicked out of my house at the beginning of my senior year in high school, and I was working as a cook. I supported myself, super low income family, never felt like a victim. One of the best things that ever happened
Yeah.
to me. And kind of built all of this. So I think maybe that's where I learned to trust the struggle. Like, I was so
Yeah.
motivated, whereas I think a lot of folks, a lot of kids aren't when they leave and they've got all this support.
Yeah.
Um, I think it gave me a giant advantage, over it. And maybe that's why. I mean, what would be your take on that? Why I've never really had the imposter syndrome. I've had
Yeah.
thoughts that weren't healthy that took me off my game, and I've
Yeah.
learned to quiet those over the years. I'm in my 60s, so I've worked on it for decades. Um, but do you think that has something to do with it? That I was just more driven to not have the impact? Because I feel like I had to build the hill before I took the hill, and then I tore it down, built it again, took it again, and so
Yeah.
like I earned this.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I should put the giant disclaimer that I am the founder of a travel agency and not a psychologist. So take that for what it's worth in my answer here for, for my degree, which is definitely not in therapy. But I can't help but feel like what you just described of, well, I have had these thoughts that took me off the rails for a second. Like, I think everyone's version is a little bit different. I actually just released today an interview with Mike Michalowicz. Have you read any of his books? Like, yeah, fantastic for small business owners, right? Profit First or Clockwork. And the way he put it was, sometimes I just have imposter days versus imposter syndrome. Sometimes I just have the days where I'm going, and this, I think this is so true of any entrepreneur, right? The days where you're going, oh my God, is this thing even going to work? So it's almost like less a belief in self and sometimes less a belief in the product while you're putting it out there because it's so vulnerable and you're having feedback and you're feeling like it's part of you. So I think it just manifests differently in everyone. I also think, and not to just reduce it down to this base simplicity, but I think the difference between a male leader and a female leader and what women are told that we can and can't do, and kind of some of those like patriarchal views that we have to work through. I think sometimes that positions us to experience it a little bit more obviously. But having run a podcast now for 3 seasons where I've interviewed men and women and always asked the question on imposter syndrome, it's been fascinating to hear how people interpret it differently. So I would say, even in your answer there of what you just said, you haven't experienced it flat out, but you have experienced those types of like inner critic moments. I think that's probably a version.
Yeah, that's a version of, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, for me now, the hack is it's a value creation lens. I'm
Mm-hmm.
focused on value, whatever the noise is, external or internal. Does it have anything to do with reality? And can it improve how I'm creating value? If the answer is no, then I shut it off. That's my
Yeah.
hack. It's a value creation lens
Yeah.
going through.
Yeah. And I think that the older you get and the more you're in the position of leadership, it's a muscle that you get to exercise, right? You brought up before we started recording, my conversation with Amy Porterfield, and she really made a great point about that too, of look, it doesn't go away, but I get much better at acknowledging it and moving forward. And I think that that's probably a great sign of evolution and progress.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, kind of back to the business a little bit here, navigating a rebrand and what went on there. What was that like going through, and what did you learn, and how big of a deal
Mhm.
was it?
Yeah. So my husband is my business partner. And, they say if you want to test a marriage, build a home together. And I would argue that if you want to test a marriage, rebrand a company together. It was a much bigger deal than we thought it would be. Naive little us. So the story behind that is in 2021, we got the opportunity. We were known as Epperly Travel, my maiden name, the company name for the 5 years that have been around. We got the opportunity to acquire Jetset World Travel, which was a company I had long admired. Female founded. The founder she's a dear friend and mentor and influence on me. And I was ecstatic that we would even be in the conversation with them, right? That we could possibly acquire this company that was older than us, larger than us, had an incredible reputation. And one thing led to another, and it worked out for us to acquire them. And for the longest, and by longest, I mean about a year, we were running the two brands side by side because Epperly was a newcomer with a great reputation that was very, respected enough to stand on its own. Jetset was more tenured. The reputation really preceded it. We can't get rid of that, right? And so we just ran the two brands parallel. And a business mentor of ours said, going to market with two brands is a bad idea long term. And we kept thinking about that and what is really best for the business, right? As we invest in it, as we build up a leadership team, if we had two brands and we kept two brands, it would have just been too confusing in the long run. And that was a very difficult decision to rebrand because the question was, which one do we rebrand to, right? Both have a lot of potential. Both are very well known in the industry. One is my literal maiden name, and one is Jetset, which when we came down to it and making this decision, I had a lot of self-work to do too, because I tied so much of my identity into the company that I created. But all of this was giving me great opportunities just to kind of like one hook at a time, unhook that identity and say, no, I am still a human of value who can create and do wonderful things, whether what I created is still called the same thing, right? So I had to take a lot of ego out of it. But we ultimately decided, let's go from me to we. And the me was Epperly and the we was Jetset. Jetset was this idea that we could build a platform for our agents and build something that was lifting them up, that they would all be really proud to represent. And so those were the decisions that went into that conversation of rebranding. And then, of course, the logistics of rebranding are just enough to make you pull your hair out. That is something I don't ever hope to go through again. It's just a lot of like the minutia that, as we talk about working on your business, you get pulled so in it when you're rebranding. It's just such a different beast of a project.
Yeah, I would imagine word of mouth is a huge part of how you get additional clientele, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And Jetset, it tells me that it's a more affluent clientele. So you're speaking to that as well. And so I'm just, my question is, I know it's a big deal to go through it and get it right. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, but how big of a deal was it really when you look back on it? If referral is the way to go, because I do see a lot of companies spend a ton on brand and the color palette, and it's got to look this way. At the end of the day, it's about generating qualified leads that have, as part of that definition, they have a high closing percentage if they're qualified, and we want to keep improving that. Brand marketing all should be at the hip with sales. So we have all that going. But looking back, was it as big a deal as you thought? I mean, the way I'm kind of framing it here.
It's interesting when you think about the client being the end traveler, and that is our B2C element, it was not that big of a deal. Those clients who are happy with our service will follow us wherever and will, no matter what we are called, right? where it became a bigger deal, and I in retrospect actually still feel I'm really glad we handled this with extreme care, is we have a B2B element of the business, and we essentially power the back office of independent contractors who could go anywhere, be served by anyone. And so for them, they needed to be able to have a sense of pride in what brand they were representing. And so it was up to us to design a brand that they would feel proud of. And I have been with a company that I did not have a sense of pride being part of, right? So I knew what it felt like if I got that wrong. So for that reason, and honestly, what was so cool, Lee, is not only did we build this company and, not only did we acquire Jetset, build a company out that they were proud of, but individuals who had left Jetset before we bought it came back to the company after we rebranded and after we showed that we are who we say we are. We are building this company for the betterment of our industry and of our team. We actually attracted previous employees who had gone elsewhere.
Yeah, that's great. Love that answer. So if we're attracting others to do business, through our brand, wildly important to get that right. So 100%. But yeah, I would have thought for your direct business, probably not that big of a deal because of the referral piece of it.
Yeah.
Did you have to raise capital for the acquisition?
No, we fortunately did not. We had to delay buying our home personally for another year. So it was a very personal decision in saying, I mentioned we had to walk away from our home in 2020. And so much of mine and my husband's story, and then what was an 18-month-old little girl time, our oldest daughter now, was what does this mean for our family? And, how quickly can we get back to a place that we can call home versus seizing this opportunity with the cash that we were able to retain throughout the pandemic. And thankfully we were able to do it without having to bring on outside investors or anything additional.
That's great.
Yeah.
I've never had to bring on any outside capital investment. I think we're way smarter with our decision making. We don't have a bunch of money. Yeah.
Honestly, it does. It forces you to be frugal, and it forces you to make sacrifices, like the decision of, all right, this is probably another year or so before we can get into a home. And that was a tough season personally. Like, we knew we were making sacrifices on the personal front in order to give our business the best shot at succeeding. But it was hard to walk that during that season.
Yeah. It also forces us to pay attention. I look at a lot of startups that have a good story and they raise a bunch of money and they make terrible decisions with it and it goes away and they lose everybody's money. You don't have money. I remember early on for me, boy, did I pay attention. Yeah. First year, first business, 360,000 in sales, almost went out of business 15 times. Our capital equipment budget was $175. We bought a bunch of shelves at an auction. They just wanted us to move them out of the warehouse.
Yeah.
And then it jumped to just under $1 million the next year and it just kept flying from there. But boy, did I pay attention. And so here's something interesting. As you're talking, I'm kind of reflecting back. I never thought it would be possible when I look at the future that it won't work. Like, this is just going to work. I know it will. But there were several times where, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? And, it feels like if I don't get this right, it could go away. But I always knew it would work. Yeah. So I had those two things going on. Did you ever feel that way? Like, it's going to work. You must have had some of that.
Yeah. So many times over the years. And, it's interesting when you talk about like not taking capital, because for those of us who are scrappy and who, like, that's one of my favorite things about myself is being scrappy and getting the opportunity to do that. I actually think it's a lot of fun. I think bootstrapping as an entrepreneur, as painful as it can be sometimes, when you look back, you're like, the things that I did to make this company succeed, right? Like, I am so proud and also a little bit cringeworthy at times. But I launched the first iteration of this business while I was still in college. So I was 20 years old and I entered into an entrepreneurship competition. And the winner of that competition would receive dollars from angel investors. They were the judges. And the best thing that could have happened to me was they got up and they announced a second place, which was not their typical. They usually gave the first place and then move forward. And they announced me as second place. And they said, we're doing this because we believe in what you're doing. We want you to keep going. And we don't want you to take our money because we know you can do it without our money. And so from that point on, having that belief too of, you don't have to raise capital. You can actually rely on the scrappiness, and the business plan you laid out was good enough for these angel investors to say, we're going to do the best thing we can for you, which is not dilute your business. I love that kind of stuff. I'm so grateful that those things happened early on, to be able to have, not that I needed their confidence, but when you're 20 years old and this is the first business you're ever pitching, like, that helps to kind of borrow confidence from others who know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think 100%, 100% there. I notice a big difference between those that really want to create value in the world and they're passionate about it. I can feel your
Mhm.
passion. It
Mhm.
exudes everywhere in the conversation, podcasts that I've listened to you on. You want to create the value. You want to build this for internal team members, for clients, and all of it. There's a large number of founders that just want to do something and make as much money as they can, as quickly as they can, and be
Yeah.
seen a certain way.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the percentage of one versus the other is, but it feels lately like the percentage of those that just want to get rich quick
Yeah.
is bigger than the ones that truly want to create value. I love operating. I love being scrappy. I love being on the front lines with the teams forming something.
Yeah.
Here's the
Yeah.
idea. Let's prove that it has some scalable traction. Now let's package it and create the experience. That is crazy fun work.
Yeah, it is. It's all in how you look at your business too. And I was taught pretty early on by some fabulous mentors who just changed the trajectory of my life, Shannon Miles, that I mentioned earlier, that that a business can be a vehicle for anything you want it to be, right? So it could be a vehicle for profit, but they looked at their businesses as a vehicle for impact and a vehicle for creating freedom and flexibility within their family. And when I look at my business, I see that. And I'm with you. I love the idea of adding value. I love the idea of creating impact. I love the idea of my husband and I just took the kids to Europe for 2 months and I took a sabbatical. I love that I could do that because of what I have built in this business, not just because it's bringing in cash, but because I've built up a leadership team that now gets to step into their highest potential because I'm stepping out of their way for those 2 months too. Like it's so cool to me, Lee, to think about creating value in terms of creating a career path for other people and trajectory for them that wouldn't have existed had you not created this company. Like just using your business as a vehicle for positive change and impact, both on the micro level within your team, but also on the macro level within an industry. How else can you do that? I mean, in what other field can you make that happen? I just think that entrepreneurship and being able to carve your own path in that way is so unique.
Yeah, 100%. And the way you're talking about it, it's how I thought about it. And I've been this way for decades. I've had, and so in total, I'm sure I've hired over 1,000 people. So these are more people that can now support their families. I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. That's why I work with kids on the virtues of entrepreneurship, because anybody that creates a job is a hero of mine, another person that can support their family. But over the years, I mean, just to kind of make the point here, dozens of spouses unsolicited say, my husband or wife is a better person to live
Mm-hmm.
with after less than a year working at your company. What are you doing down there?
Cool.
And emotional energy value was the X factor for leaders. It was a big part of the leadership development work I did. I would spend 60% of my time at the end just working with and developing my 64 leaders in this one business. Before I sold it. And then the connectedness piece on the spiritual side, all kinds of programs to make sure that was happening. A 10,000 square foot gym, if you trained with other employees,
Yeah.
you get consistently, you got more money every month. Bring your family members in, you get even more. And so those that focus only on the material value creation, money, 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 and let's
Mm-hmm.
go. At that time, when I sold the two aerospace businesses into one to Textron, most were getting an 8x multiple if they were really
Mm-hmm.
strong.
Mm-hmm.
We got a 21.6x multiple,
Get out of here, Lee.
but
Wow.
because of those other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the way, we feel better when we focus on that.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing wrong with focusing on money. I think it's an important thing to cultivate. But if you're out of
Right.
balance, you don't feel right.
Well, it makes so much sense. The influence, the way that you place an emphasis on creating value for an investor. I mean, it makes sense that you're seeing the line items and how they actually manifest into more profit, which is not your focus. It's just a byproduct, but it's because you're creating value in individuals' lives, emotionally, spiritually, all of the things.
Yeah.
I
And
think we
the
have to look at this holistically. Like we're not just people that show up with our computers and type away and go home anymore. Like this is a business is creating a place where you spend the majority of your life when you're an employee, right?
Yeah. And we're all on a journey together. Everybody's life is just as important to them as yours is to you.
Yeah.
And are we here supporting each other on that journey, or is it just transactional?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I was fortunate to go into an industry that was making that change even to, the service level, like we talked about earlier. And so what we're able to provide as a service is relationship driven. It would make no sense if behind the scenes, it was simply a transaction. It's got to be that way. It's the Chick-fil-A model, right? When you take care of your employees, they take care of your customers. And I think that is, we've seen that evidence time and time again at Jetset.
Yeah, it's a relationship for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe how fast the time is going. We had another question, and then we can start wrapping it up. You stay on the leading edge of where you need to develop to continually increase the value that of your organization and that it provides. It's so clear. As you're scaling, going from smaller to acquisition, what was if you could even pick one, the biggest lesson that you can help our listeners with that you learned on being able to scale?
So the biggest lesson, and this was truly the best piece of advice because of the timing of it. I've mentioned my mentor a number of times. I was on a call with her October of 2019, and she said, Lindsey, the tighter you cling, the slower you will grow. And I thought, that's nice. Went on with my way. I thought, I'll let go a little bit more. Thank you for that advice. And then, of course, the pandemic forced my hand. And I learned that lesson through the rawest way possible of the tighter I cling, the slower I grow. I think for me, it had to be that way. I don't know that I could have learned it on my own, but if I could help other people to know that is so true, that like counterintuitively, we think that I'm going to be so much more stressed out when I give up more of this, control, because then I have to trust someone else to do it. So it was learning the art of delegation, but doing so in a way that I now realize, oh, wait, actually, I live a much less anxious life now that I have a team built up around me who are each using their unique strengths, that I've been able to give away some of that, that burden of not feeling like it just all rises and falls on me. And then our growth just went through the roof because of that. So I fully, fully believe that is the best advice I've ever been given. And that is something that I would hope to others, that you could learn from my experience and not have to go through the leveling of your business to actually, start implementing that.
And I do think it's the kind of advice where, yeah, that sounds nice. And then 3 years later, oh my gosh, they were so right.
They were so right. Yeah. Mine just happened to be like 3 months later. And it was, that was foreshadowing, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I think as leaders, when we plant seeds, if it took us a decade to figure it out, let's give them at least 10 minutes, right? So we're planting a seed and let's see what happens 3 months or 6 months down the road as we develop folks. Yeah. From this discussion, Lindsey, what was your biggest takeaway as you think about it? I've loved this discussion. It's been great.
I have too. I really appreciate the way that you look at adding value. And especially as we think about how that affects not just the bottom line of our business, but the entire culture of the business, right? When we can look at adding value in those specific ways, I really appreciate how you've got them in buckets, how you intro the show, and you're very clear in how you've done that in each of your businesses. And so for me, that my takeaway is learning from you and how you've managed to do that and how you do that on the show too. It's very evident how you ask your questions to be able to add value to your listeners. So I very much appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. And my whole purpose in life right now is to drive holistic value creation behaviors into the world. It'll be a way better world for all of us to interact with if more of us do that. So that's why I do it. My biggest takeaway is how you just directly deal with limiting beliefs, however they come in. So whether it's imposter syndrome, perfectionism, and what can happen there, but just addressing it, always being aware of it and going forward. And that's going to be helpful for me as I have more of these conversations.
Yeah. Thank you for addressing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast, where we explore the art of value creation. If you got value out of today's episode, please leave a review. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. And until next time, show the world your value.